like a Hellcat.
Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another Sega Saturn review, and without a doubt today's game is the most mystical, sought after and rarest game on the system. I'm of course talking about Panzer Dragoon Saga, which saw a release in May of 1998 over here in Europe after it had originally been released in January of 1998 over in Japan. So if you're unaware, Panzer Dragoon Saga was the third game in the series after we'd previously seen Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Zwei. Of course, the major difference here was that it moved away from the on-rail shooter action that the previous two games had given you and became a full-blown JRPG. Now, obviously, when this came out in 1998, JRPGs were the big thing. We'd seen Grandia on the Saturn, and of course we'd seen Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, so Sega ultimately decided that that would be the best way to take the series forward. So the story is that you take control of Edge, who's a hunter hired by the Empire, and he guards an excavation site which is full of artifacts from the ancient age. And as they're working, an ancient monster appears and they try and fend it off, and he discovers a girl buried in the wall who later becomes known as Azel. But unfortunately the site is attacked by the Black Fleet, who sees the girl, kill all of Edge's companions and shoot Edge, but Edge survives. He escapes with the help of the mysterious dragon, and he swears revenge on the Black Fleet leader himself, known as Kramen. I'm going to go on record and say straight away, this is without a doubt the biggest and the most complicated review that I have ever put together on the Saturn, without a doubt. It's such an important game in the Saturn's library that I felt I really had to give it everything that I possibly could to do it justification. But we will be doing what we usually do, and that is talk about how it looks in the graphics, how it sounds, how it plays, what kind of content and lifespan it's got, whether it's still worth playing today, and where it may end up in our Sega Saturn top 10, and can it even make it to number 1, knocking Shining Force 3 off the top spot. So like I always do, I'm going to start off with the visuals first, and without a doubt Panzer Dragoon is the most ambitious 3D game on the entire system. I don't think anybody is going to argue with that. You've got a full 3D world. Everything is 3D in this game, whether you're talking about the towns, the dungeons that you'll fly through, the big vast open spaces that you'll fly through, or the combat engine. It is all 3D, and the Saturn deserves a massive amount of credit for being able to pull this off. So as you originally start the game on foot, I thought it would be best to talk about all those kind of locations that you walk around to start with. And for all intent purposes, these locations fit the style and setting of the game very, very well. They've got this kind of aged, olden feel to them, and they suit the style of the game. Now, they're not going to blow you away in terms of graphical quality, but at the same time, you have to think about RPGs at this time. There were no full 3D ones like this. If you think about the other games that were out at this kind of time, like Wild Arms, Grandia, Albert Odyssey, even Final Fantasy VII, lots of them used 2D aspects, whether it was 2D backdrops and 3D characters, or just completely 2D, or 3D backdrops and 2D characters. Panzer Dragoon is massively ambitious in the fact that it just goes for 3D everything. And the town locations, the camp locations, they all do the job. So the main part of the game graphically is you flying around on your dragon and then engaging in battles. Now the flying sections are broken up into different styles of areas. You've got large expansive areas that you're flying around exploring, usually doing things like hitting switches, trying to find passageways to traverse to the next area. And these areas are probably the least impressive part of the game, mainly because they're cluttered with pop-up in the distance and they feel quite lonely and like there's not a whole lot going on in them graphically. I was quite disappointed with these areas of the game. Now the smaller, much more confined areas like the tunnels that you fly through and the dungeon style places where you traverse to meet bosses of locations, these are far more impressive graphically. They perform much better. There's far less pop-up. I feel all the textures in these areas are much better as well, and they're far more impressive to view, and they get better as the game goes along as well. So in this aspect, I was really impressed with the game. And now going into the combat engine as well, this is where you'll probably see some of the best polygonal sort of characters and enemy models on the entire game, because they're really, really decent. Especially the more larger, impressive bosses, they look really, really good, and your dragon as well looks good too. Unfortunately, all your special moves in battle just seem a little bit timid and a little bit lackluster, not as spectacular as I wish they would. Even the most powerful ones, I feel, don't compare to moves off other RPGs around this time. I just feel they needed to be more dramatic, more explosive, more dynamic to give the battles just that little bit more of excitement. And overall, in the graphics department, Panzer Dragoon Saga is a really decent game. I just feel it's let down by some little niggles here and there, which probably stop it from being one of the absolute best looking games on the system. So moving on to what I consider the absolutely standout point of the game, and that is the brilliant soundtrack and sound effects that you get in Panzer Dragoon Saga. I haven't got a negative thing to say about anything here. All the sound effects for battles and the dragon sounds are all fantastic. The game is fully voiced. Unfortunately, it is in Japanese, and I'm not a big fan of listening to Japanese audio with English overlay text, but you get used to it here, and I'm not going to mark it down for that. It would have been fantastic if it had been converted to English, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. But the soundtrack is where the real credit lies here, because this soundtrack fits this game so well. I said with Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Zwei that they had fantastic soundtracks, and they really did. They were superb. But Panzer Dragoon Saga, I feel it takes it to another level, because the soundtrack here makes you feel alone, makes you feel like you're in the wilderness and you should be worried about what is going on. It really is that good. So of course, what I need to do for you is give you some examples of this fantastic soundtrack. So moving on to gameplay next, and Panzer Dragoon Saga is split up into 3 distinct playstyles: moving around on foot, flying around on your dragon, and the combat. Now when you're moving around on foot, you're going to be doing all of your standard RPG stuff, interacting with other characters, buying items, opening chests, all of that kind of stuff. Now Edge controls reasonably well for these sections. I'd say you move him with the analog stick or the D-pad. You hold B to run, although he does run like he's got lead boots. You press A to bring up your target reticle, and then you move it around the screen and press A again to highlight what you want to interact with. I do find this clunky. I think it would have been much more fluent if you simply interacted with things by moving up to them and pressing A. So moving on to the flying gameplay next, and it won't be any surprise when I tell you that Panzer Dragoon Saga plays really well in these sections coming from the two previous games. It's smooth, it's responsive, the dragon controls really well. Whether you're using the D-pad or the analog stick, you hold the B button to accelerate. You can press L so that he keeps on going at the same speed until you stop. You can press R to do a spin, and A is your target reticle, which enables you to interact with things and break things. The downside with this area of the gameplay is the big open spaces feel very, very tedious and repetitive to fly through. Your dragon feels so slow in these areas, and that's to give it a sense of grand scale, basically, to make you feel like you're flying through such a big area. But it feels a bit boring and a bit tedious, and you are there just wishing your dragon could fly through these areas a bit quicker. Much better in the tunnels, like I said, with the graphics. Flies much more responsive, quicker, and these have got a much better sense of speed as well, so it's more enjoyable flying around these areas. So that leaves us with just the combat left to discuss, and I think this game has really divided opinions on the combat. Some people prefer the non-stop shooting of the previous games, and other people do prefer the more tactical, slow, turn-based JRPG style of battles. Now, I do feel the battle system is quite simplified from other RPGs. There's not a massive element of leveling up, gaining new skills. There's not really a whole lot of that going on here, and in fact you will get through the game basically just relying on your gun and your lasers. Your special attacks kind of feel redundant apart from the healing and the defensive ones. Now, in terms of its combat mechanics, you move the dragon around from side to side around your enemies, trying to avoid being in line of their most powerful attacks whilst trying to attack their weak spots at the same time. A lot of the time you will need to be in their direct line of fire to hit their weak spots, but of course this is how you deal the most damage and pretty much defeat every boss throughout the game. Now, for me, the idea of moving around side to side was a good one in principle, but it gets very repetitive the more you play the game, and you move and then you're moved back because the enemy moves, and it gets frustrating, and you're wishing that you were just sat there probably in a Final Fantasy VII kind of turn-based one, just because it's more straightforward and in fact it's more enjoyable. I do find the battle system on this game just a little bit frustrating. It's not overly difficult, in all fairness. The game, learning the attacks and the controls, is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot to grasp. There's not thousands and thousands of items to use in the game. Really just curing items are the most important ones, and ones like speed chips, defensive chips to improve your statistics during the battles. Just like other RPGs, you level up after you gain XP, you learn new skills as you go along. Depending on the style of class of dragon that you use the most, it will affect the rate and the speed at which you learn abilities for different categories, if that makes sense. It's quite difficult to explain, but it's actually very simplistic to understand. The downside is I kind of felt that you didn't really need to change your dragon settings to get through the game. You could just leave it on standard 100 across everything, learn the abilities at a standard rate, and you'll actually be fine. And it's kind of disappointing because it's in there, but it feels like it's more of a novelty value, changing your dragon style, than an absolute necessity. And indeed, when you get the ultimate dragon form, you're stuck at 100 in all of your stats regardless. You can no longer edit it anyway, so kind of feels a little bit redundant by the time you get to the end of the game. And quite a lot of the abilities you learn, you never even need to use, if I'm perfectly honest. You will get through the game just relying on your standard gun and lasers. And it wasn't until the very final boss on the game where I find myself spamming my special moves over and over again. It was kind of disappointing, in all fairness, because you do learn a reasonable amount of skills, but in all fairness, you don't really need to use a lot of them. So moving on to content and lifespan next, I'm going to try and summarize it as good as I can without going on and on forever. Now, if you're expecting a brilliant, detailed, long-winded story where it lasts about 30 to 40 hours, loads of character development and deep, rich history for those characters as you get to know them and bond with them, you're probably going to be disappointed, because Panzer Dragoon Saga doesn't give you that. In terms of storyline, it's kind of vague, it's not particularly good, it's not very gripping, in all honesty, and the lead character, Edge, is so bland and so generic, you will have very little interest or care in him whatsoever. It's kind of disappointing when the lead character of a game is just completely indifferent. He hasn't got any outstanding features. He comes across as a bit of a loser, in all fairness, and it's kind of disappointing when you have a main character like that. You don't really build any great bonds with anybody. Yes, there is a female character called Azelle who does eventually join with you towards the end of the game, but there isn't really anything else. It's not like a standard RPG from the time. You feel lonely, you feel by yourself for the large majority of the game. Now, some people will like that. Other people, like myself, would probably much prefer an RPG where you're building up a great group of characters who all have detailed, rich backgrounds for you to delve into. This doesn't have that. Edge doesn't really have much of a background at all, in all fairness. Now, in terms of overall lifespan, it's going to take you around about 15 hours to do, and that is if you're doing pretty much most of the stuff in the game as well. It's not got a whole massive array of side quests like a lot of other RPGs at the time, and the storyline isn't that deep. It's made up of quite a lot of FMV sequences and a lot of Japanese voice acting as well. I do feel that probably the large majority of the disc space is actually taken up with the full motion video, hence why the game is actually relatively small, and there isn't a massive amount of places that you visit in the game either, because you keep going back to the same couple of towns in the game and you will have to revisit the same locations that you've already been to previously. So I do feel it does get a bit tedious and a little bit repetitive overall. In terms of the menu system and the item upgrades for your character, there really aren't that many. You can get new weapons occasionally in the game, and that is it. There's no armor, there's no accessories, nothing at all like that. And like I said before, the items in the game, they're really just used for curing, and you can use a few which will help boost your statistics in battle. It is quite a simplified RPG in all fairness, and I guess when you were coming from a shooter like the previous two games to try and turn that into an RPG, I guess they might well have been worried that they were going to put people off who like the original two games, so perhaps they kept that bit simpler in the game. That's just my opinion. Whether I'm right or wrong, I've no idea. Once you do complete the game, then there are 3 little mini games that you get added to the world map just to give you as a little bit of a reward, I guess, for completing the game. You can move around a campsite as a little dragon. I'm not really sure of the purpose of this one. You can fly through the valley and have your time saved, and you can do an Empire shooting game where you try and get as many points as you can in 3 minutes. There's nothing here that's going to keep you coming back for more. They're really just little trinkets for completing the game. Now, when you do complete the game, you'll be given an overall score for like map coverage, items collected, and this for me is probably the only reason why you'd come back to play the game ever again, because if you wanted to try and get 100% on all of those, you're not going to be coming back, in my opinion, for the story, because the story's not that great and it doesn't really grip you. And I was actually happy when I finished the game. With great RPGs, I have this little feeling of disappointment when you finish the game because the story is over and there's nothing more to experience. With this game, I was glad to get it out of the way because it was just repetitive in many ways and the story just didn't grip me. So that brings us to the end of the review and the 2 final questions. Is this game worth playing today, and does it make our Sega Saturn top 10? Now, I've not covered every single nook and cranny of this game in the review, and I said previously that this is going to be the most difficult review that I've ever done, and it is, because the game is on such a grand scale. It's really hard to try and cover every single thing within the game in just one small review. Now, is it worth still playing? Yes, it is, because there's nothing else like this on the Sega Saturn, and it changes it up quite a lot from Panzer Dragoon 1 and Panzer Dragoon Saga, and it gives you this completely different kind of game. Is it up there with the best RPGs on the system, though? Probably not, because the storyline's just not as good as other RPGs from around the time, whether you're talking about ones on the Saturn or the PlayStation. I just feel, if you're like me and you've experienced all of the RPGs pretty much from that era, then you've got so much comparisons to make to other games from this game, and it just doesn't perform as well in terms of storyline. And that for me will always be the most important thing with an RPG, how gripping and interesting the story and the characters are. That being said, it still plays pretty good overall. The battle system is okay, but yes, it does get repetitive. But as an experience playing it, it is worth playing still, because there's nothing else like it on the Saturn, like I said. Now, does it make our Sega Saturn top 10? Is the really, really difficult question. And as you can see now on the screen, our PAL Sega Saturn Top 10 has the likes of Shining Force 3, Sonic Jam, Street Fighter Alpha 2, all the way down to Resident Evil and Sega Rally at the bottom. And for me, it's a really difficult decision to say whether Panzer Dragoon gets into the top 10, whether it's better than any of those games in that list to me. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, it's the best game on the system. Now, I've heard a lot of people say it's the best game on the system, but I've never heard much justification why. And after playing it, it's really difficult to say it's the best game on the system. I can't say it's the best game on the system. Shining Force 3 is better than Panzer Dragoon in just about every single way. And moving down the list, it's really hard to think about where I would put Panzer Dragoon Saga. It's not as good as Street Fighter Alpha 2. It's not as good as Virtua Fighter 2 or Fighters Megamix, I don't feel, as an overall game experience. Is it better than Dark Savior? They're completely different styles of RPG, but I tend to feel Dark Savior is more gripping to play, in all honesty. Even moving down to Mystaria, I feel that is more gripping to play, basically because of the combat being more enjoyable than this game. Graphically, it's nowhere near as good. In terms of sound effects and music, it's nowhere near as good. Panzer Dragoon excels with its soundtrack. It's brilliant. But as an overall game, I still feel Mystaria is better, which means Panzer Dragoon Saga is entering our Sega Saturn Top 10 at number 10. It's removing Sega Rally from the top 10. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me. Tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, but again, it's my top 10. It's my list, so what I say goes. If you don't agree with me, let me know down below, but tell me why. If you think this is the best game on the system, tell me why, because for me, it's just not got it overall. It's too repetitive in certain areas, and the storyline is not as good as I wished it was. That is all for today. Thank you for watching, and like always, I'll be back in the near future with another review. Goodbye for now.
再び全てを始めるために